Hi guys, Bobo here, and this is a little bit of a different video. I have a guest, and this is going to be sort of an interview or maybe a podcast of sorts. And this is Russ Mitchell. Hi, Russ.
Hi.
I'm not going to try to introduce you. Instead, I'll give that to you. From what I know, you're a HEMA instructor, although you don't call yourself that much often. And you're a specialist in Saber, and you have written a shit ton of books on it. Can you tell me more?
All right, so I'm a HEMA dinosaur. I tend to use historical fencing rather than HEMA because some of what I do, I'm convinced, has non-European roots. When I look at some of the, where do I start? Not the beginning, that's too long. We'll bore the people who are watching you. I'm a HEMA guy who has been around for a long time. I'm an absolute dinosaur. Somewhere on a bookshelf back there, I've got Paulus Hector Mare on microfilm. So I've been doing this for a very long time. And in the process, I stumbled into some living lineages. And one of the living lineages is French and Basque. And in that process, I became convinced that a lot of the less formal French martial arts have an awful lot of Caribbean and Mediterranean, North African DNA. And if you look at the histories of how those people move around and interact, it becomes very clear why that might be the case. So not everything I do can be classified as strictly and purely European. I can give you an example. There's a well-known gentleman who does North African swordplay. His name is Steve. So he and I play now and then. And sometimes he'll ask me to come in to be the uke for the techniques because we immediately start playing. I know all of his moves. He knows all of my moves. We've never trained together. There's that much overlap and similarity between the styles of stick and sword playing that we're doing that it takes literally a microscopic adjustment of, okay, be willing to bend the knees more rather than keep myself tall and extended. And then literally everything I know looks like everything he knows. So that's why I use historical fencing rather than HEMA, because I don't want to missell myself or miscommunicate to people.
That's actually a funny thing. I've recently had a discussion like this online. I think that a lot of Americans don't realize that in Europe, a lot of people don't use HEMA as an acronym. The French use it. A couple of other official places with federations use some variant of it, but especially Central and Eastern Europe, we use as well the local equivalent to historical fencing. Another reason for that would be that the HEMA, if we translate it, for example, in Bulgarian, it sounds like fuck. So naturally, we don't use it.
No.
Yeah. But I've never thought about the fact that there may be, well, of course I've thought about it, but the fact that there may be some mixture of non-European parts in our fencing traditions and that we study should necessarily disqualify the term. I think it's just a big umbrella term. And
it is.
Yeah, I think that also if we look at earlier sources and not Saber in particular, we can say that some of them probably also had Eastern, Middle Eastern influences. We see some, you mentioned Mayer. I think there was in one of the manuscripts that he saved, I think there was a dude with Eastern sabers in them, two of them, or maybe I'm mistaken with another source, but in the same style. So
I would agree with that, absolutely. For example, the French start using the falchion. And they start using the falchion at a very specific point in time, which should be right in your wheelhouse because it's after they literally run away after Koja kicks their asses at the Battle of Adrianople in 1215. Well, most French people have no idea what the Battle of Adrianople was. And most people to this day don't realize the Fourth Crusade ended because the Bulgars and Cumans kicked their asses.
Yeah.
But it's actually in Villard-Douai. Villard-Douai literally says they all got on the ships and went home. They didn't know what to do because they were so outmatched. And it's roughly after that point that we start seeing the falchion happening. So there's always a lot of give and take back and forth culturally, even if it's just, I fought these guys and their sword was neat, make me something kind of like it.
And actually, I love that you mentioned Bulgarian history, well, older Bulgarian history, Bulgar history, because this is sort of also the place where, also a bit northern from us in today's Hungary,
Mhm.
also is the place where saber and straight swords kind of connected. Because we have a lot of early sabers. As you probably well known, I mean, surviving ones, a
Mhm.
lot compared to other stuff. And what we know from historical sources is in the high medieval, especially when we used Kumans a lot as mercenaries, and some of them weren't just mercenaries, some of them basically moved here.
Right.
Uh, there are sources that indicate that Bulgar, well, let's call them knights because they were basically the equivalent of knights. A lot of them carried a straight Western sword and a local saber at the same time, one on the saddle, one on the waist, and that was, of course, we don't have any surviving sources from the time, but in this land, and from what I know, also northern from here up to Hungary. These two weapons, the straight and the curved, kind of existed together.
Absolutely. One of the fundamental problems, and I somewhere out on the YouTube, I have a lecture that's really hard to understand because the audio is terrible. One of the problems is that when the Mongols come through and destroy Kiev, they destroy Chernigov, they destroy the old Kievan Rus. There is a huge zone of martial culture in East Central and Eastern Europe, the eastern half of which gets completely destroyed. So
Mm.
Hungary, Bulgaria, all of this suddenly becomes the edge of things. And how do you explain that things are very different? Or that in half of Europe, for example, a nobleman might have no reservations whatsoever about using a missile weapon on a battlefield, which is totally alien to the Western European mindset, because the Germanic mindset is get close, close, destroy. Whereas in East Central Europe, the size and area that you have to maneuver is so much greater that they have to use combined arms warfare. Your heavy and your light horse have to cooperate, or you can't catch the bastards.
Hmm. And this brings us to the question of saber as a weapon before what HEMA knows about it, because I've noticed I'm not a saber myself, and I haven't had much interest in it, but I'm interested in everything sooner or later, and I've noticed
Mhm.
that in most of HEMA, saber people do some variation of British military saber. And I've read some of the sources, and I can kind of understand it, especially comparing to the pain of earlier fencing sources like longsword sources, or let's not talk about sword and buckler because then I'll be ranting and not you, and I want you to be ranting. But it seems that a lot of people in Saber, and I'm excluding the group that supposedly do Polish Saber, uh, a lot of them just focus on relatively late Saber, most of it written, and the treatises are made very simple, which is great in some ways. I think that a lot of them are intended to just teach soldiers in a couple of weeks the basics of it, and maybe something extra for the officers or the more interested people. And that's enough for a lot of people to fence very well.
Yes, it
But
is.
you study later sources, but a tradition that has earlier roots to earlier types of saber.
Absolutely. One of the fundamental issues, and here's where I'm going to get really controversial, so prepare for the hate mail. It'll be aimed at me, not you, so you're safe. One of the fundamental problems is that we get all tied up on vocabulary. So
Mm.
the saber hits Western Europe in the 18th century, which is, if you know the archaeological finds and sources, the saber's already been in Europe in its mature form for literally a millennia by the time the Regiment Berchigny is formed, for example, in France. And the English and the French, the Spaniards had lots of exposure to it earlier. But by the time the English and the French start seeing and interacting and adopting sabers en masse, it was already beyond a mature form. It was a mature and elaborated form. If we look at the vocabulary of the saber and what you call it, okay, it comes back to sabia. What does sabia mean? Sabia is a Turkic word. Sabia has the same kind of Turkic structure as, for example, buzodgan has, or the old
Hmm.
mace. So a mace is a crusher or a destroyer. It's a thing you smash things with. A sabia is a chopper or a lopper. We have plenty of people going every day in the United States who have never seen any Turkic vocabulary, who use tools every day whose fundamental point is they're named according to the function they do. A joiner, a router, all of these kinds of things. So you then look at, okay, who are the neighbors who also use this? Okay, the Bulgars have the saber around the same time the Hungarians do. The Bulgars and the ancient Hungarians are sometimes enemies, sometimes allies. Very often it's complicated. We don't need to lecture about the High Middle Ages to people. But then you look at the neighbor, what's the Tesak? That becomes Dusak when it's transliterated in the German. What does Tesak or Tasak mean in the local Slavic languages, for example, in Bohemia? Chopper, chopper.
Sure. Yeah.
Yeah, it is literally the same word brought into the language of people who were also rubbing shoulders with the Magyars since the 8th, 9th, 10th century, hiring them as mercenaries, fighting them off, assisting people in their rebellions, or hiring them in to work with somebody else's rebellions, all the medieval history. So we have these words, and I tell people Dusak is saber, and people look at me like I've grown 3 heads. But it's not an accident that you go to all the old armories and you see Dusak on the wall, and they're not flax knives or leather training tools. They're giant fuck off baskets, pardon my French, giant sabers. And some of them are sabers with Adriatic style basket hilts.
Yep.
Which is where we know the basket hilt tends to come from. And a bunch of them are those with big cavalry blades, and a bunch of those are with little shorter blades, because unlike the 21st century, they didn't think in terms of models. Did you want a bigger saber or a smaller saber? Who cares? The smith makes you what you want. This is not an era with industrial standardization. So then we go next door. What do the Italians have? Coltellaccio, long knife. What do the Saxons and Swabians living in Hungary have? Langesmesser, long knife. What do the Adagians have? Shashka, long knife. What do the Chinese have? Dao, long knife. So these words are interchangeable. And if you look at a number of the sources, when you see Langesmesser and Dusak sources, these are the training weapons for saber. Now, the Saxons preferred their false edge or short edge with clip points. Look at the Saxon stuff. They really like clip points. They're into it. The Bohemians also like clip points. They're into it. But a Langesmesser is not a Bauernwehr. It's not simply a long peasant's hunting knife. It's not a Ruger. We know this because those weapons don't have the short edges of the type we see in the fencing manuals. And when we put the fencing manual in front of the history, we get ourselves in trouble trying to understand where these weapons come from. For example, from a HEMA perspective, the 18th century is kind of dead for saber manuals. The point at which the saber is penetrating to its furthest throughout Europe just happens to be the point in the era of the Enlightenment and highly centralized monarchies, where the civilian versus military distinction is becoming most effective, where we don't see lots and lots of middle-class people training with what they will now consider military weapons. We don't see the manuals, but that doesn't mean the sabers and the weapons aren't around. And it doesn't mean they didn't use different words for them. And before the people listening get really, really upset, go check out Jakobsutter and go check out Powerfight or Fechtkunst, the Dutch manuscript from the 17th century, and see how many of these things that are not using the Eastern European vocabulary just happen to look like sabers. It's not an accident.
I was going to say that I can make it even more controversial. Since you're a HEMA dinosaur, you should remember that some years ago, there were 2 of your fellow countrymen who had a hypothesis. They call it the pan-European theory.
Mm-hmm.
And I'll water it down very much and explain it very simply. But basically, their argument was that longsword fencing has a core root all over Europe, and German, Italian, and even English sources share the same principles on some level, and then the local vocabulary, technical terms just change things up a bit, but the base is the same.
Bullshit.
This is essentially the same thing for saber all over the world, or at least the Eurasian continent.
Okay, so We can say, because we have Kunsteffekten's manuscripts that say so, that the method of longsword put together in the synthesis method that Lichtenauer created, or that is attributed to Lichtenauer and his initial students, comes from the use of the Langesmesser. We can posit that this may actually be true. We can posit that it may be a toss-off line that one or another person writing just put in there. You can then go back and look at descriptions of the techniques and stuff and go, is it true? Is it not? If I want to be a saber overlord, I could look in the manuscripts and try to make the argument that saber usage and the extensive use of the false edge creates what we call German longsword. And you can also make an argument that what that really is unarmored Silesian longsword that the Germans pick up from the Silesians. We can go all back and forth. But if you look at a lot of the other manuscripts, you see that that stuff doesn't fly. You can see, for example, in the Schädelhau is a survival of bog standard sword and shield swordplay that you can see shown all over the actual High Middle Ages artwork. You can see this angle being used all the time. They're simply using it with a longsword because it's convenient for the exact same purpose that is convenient in the High Middle Ages. What if you have to hit somebody in the head or go around the shield? Especially in the High Middle Ages, when the metallurgy hasn't caught up yet. There's a big difference between smacking somebody who's wearing a great helmet in the 13th century and smacking somebody who's wearing a heavy helmet in the 15th century. In the 15th century, they're going to laugh at you. In the 13th century, you might split that helmet. And simply because of the difference between iron and steel. Late 14th century, they're starting to understand what steel is in terms of use, but they still have no idea what the chemistry behind it is. They still think steel is a more pure version of iron rather than vice versa. Sorry, I interrupted you.
No, I was going to say that especially with earlier helmets, when you don't have all the support of the helmet and all the structures that connect the armor, even if the hit doesn't go through the helmet, the solid hit to the head is still a very solid hit to the head and may daze the opponent. It may give you an opening for a thrust or something more deadly. So,
or if you hit it just right and or just wrong, depending on whether it's warfare or play, you may accidentally give the guy a hangman's break. So, you know.
Yeah.
Valid. So you see that in some of the artwork, but the Italian traditions, can we say, are they operating under Kunsteffekten's principles? I would not make that argument, for the simple fact that the Italian traditions disdain the middle bind. And the Kunsteffekten tradition, all of the Meisterhau depend upon maneuvering your opponent to a middle bind, which is in theory the worst thing you can possibly do, but which allows you to then pull off these sneaky attacks on a broken tempo inside the bind, which is what the Meisterhau fundamentally are. So just like Japanese swordplay will intentionally attack in bad tempo in order to sucker them into attacking at you. Oh boy, it's Christmas, look what he just did. And then they clonk you in the face. Or a Muay Thai guy puts his arms like this up and you go, oh, I'm going to get me some ribs. Narrator's voice, you are not getting yourself some ribs. That's a trap, right? So Kunsteffekten is doing something that an untrained fighter does because they don't know any better, and then weaponizing that if you're stupid enough to try to double down and remise into it. I don't see that in the Italian traditions. So I would not be on board with the pan-European thesis.
But then we turn to the question of why and how did straight and curved swords, or let's just call them saber and swords, how did they live together in that period, and why do we not see them? For example, we see with Messer and arming sword, we see in Tauhofer that he says he basically makes them appear to be the same. He shows illustrations of arming sword being used and calls it the Messer and vice versa. And we know that the sword and buckler stuff can be, in some sources, can be Messer and buckler stuff, and nothing really changes. So some German sources make an equivalency between straight swords and straight two-edged swords and single-edged swords.
As do the French, as do the English. Shockingly, the cultures for whom the curved sword is not native don't seem to find the difference very significant. The cultures, if I go into East Central Europe and I look at a palosh and I go, oh, look, a saber, I'm going to get laughed out of the museum unless they don't realize it's serious or don't realize I'm joking. They go, oh, clueless Westerner, he doesn't know. You know, you don't look at Mitch and call it Saber. It's not done. So these things existed side by side because they give you different things. One, you have to remember that people are re-hilting their weapons. Swords are disposable objects and blades break. You don't throw away good furniture that you like just because the blade broke. You have your smith knock out the rest of the peen and you put in a saber handle, and now you have a straight blade, and now you have the palosh, and the palosh gives you more reach. The saber gives you more curve. So if I am having a curved blade, I have a long blade in a short space. That gives me certain advantages. I give up reach. We can see this, for example, later on in the Hebfechten texts for the Germans and Prussian traditions, where they literally tell you you have different plays depending on whether you're wielding a palosh or a cutting dagger versus whether you're doing a saber. The tactics change because your reach changes. In exchange for giving up a little bit of reach, you get something that this doesn't give you. This is my key-in that I use for online teaching because it's convenient for camera. If I do this with a straight weapon, I've changed nothing about the geometry of the fight, except possibly where my key-ins are facing. Nothing's different. If I do this with a saber, this arc creates a very different situation than this arc. If I flip this over, it gets me almost nothing. Now, if I flip this over and roll my hand and throw my elbow, it gets me something. But if I do this with a saber, I've already fundamentally changed the engagement because the curve. So if, for example, my lineage has, and a lot of Austro-Hungarian later lineages have what they call opposition parries. So we're hanging out in the middle guard for the purpose of getting you to pick a side. Once you've picked a side, I start drifting. With a straight weapon, this is very, very unimpressive. If I want to really say, don't go here, buddy, I have to take this bigger. I come to here and now you're saying, okay, now I got to change lines, right? Or double down on it when he knows I'm going to be doubling down on it. Here, this means nothing. But with a curved blade, my tip is over here. I've now covered this quadrant with a solid block and this one with a yielding parry for a very small displacement of my hand. And I have all the false edge bullshit we know and love from all the Kunsteffektens manuscripts, especially with the raised yeomans that are common in the region. So they give you different tools, and we do in fact see them living side by side. The Cumans, for example, and many Hungarians who are part of the absolutely brutal ass kicking that the Hungarians give to southern Italy during the southern half of the 100 Years' War, when the Neapolitan Angevins and their descendants in Hungary are fighting with Joanna over who gets to be the Pope's landlord. It's not quite right. Joanna's the Pope's landlord in Angevin territories. And there's a whole bunch of back and forth there. These guys are using long swords or long swords. They don't think twice about it. Why? Sometimes from horseback, a long pokey thing, which happens to be the knightly standard weapon at the time. Really, really pointy Type 15 long swords that we see all over Giro le Courtois or Chronicon Picton. They're really useful for fighting from horseback because you get that extra reach for stabbing people. But many times, just as you've alluded, the horsemen are carrying a straight sword on the saddle, the saber on their person because it's handy. They may have an axe in their saddle as well. They may have javelins and bows with their saddle. They may also be carrying a mace. So I made waves a long time ago, presenting to De Re Militari, positing that there is a kind of medium cavalry that really does exist. And it's this Swiss Army knife cavalry that East Central Europe takes for granted in its history that's really alien to Western Europe. Western Europe has cold blood horses, so their cavalry can't do a lot of maneuver and chasey warfare in the Middle Ages the way they later on do in the Napoleonic Wars. They've literally got the wrong horses. The Cumans, the Bulgars, the Hungarians, they have Arabs from the 11th century on that we know of, maybe earlier. 11th, 12th century on, we see hot-blooded horses throughout the graves in the cemeteries. So we know that they had big horses, we had big grumpy ponies, and we had very light horses who could run very far, very fast. We needed a different kind of cavalry. We also have different terrain. There are parts of Western Europe where when two cities go to war, it's literally a question of who controls the road between them. Not a lot of maneuver warfare going on. It's literally fighting over a roadway, because whoever controls the roadway controls the trade gets to dictate the terms of how the nobles who influence those cities relate.
That's I can actually give another example with the horses. That's something I haven't thought about checking out and comparing between Eastern and Western Europe. But years ago, when I still studied Japanese stuff and kenjutsu, I was curious as to why the katana, especially, well, in some periods it grew longer, but it almost never was that long. And aside from the height of the Japanese before the 18th century, which was a lot shorter than now, the other thing that was really short in Japan were the horses. From what I remember, horses in 14th, 15th century Japan were about 1.4 meters, or like this tall at the shoulder, which means in Europe we would call them ponies. And if you're on a big fat pony, you don't want to be using a sword that's really long. It doesn't make sense. You cannot even carry it properly on a horse that small, so you just don't use a big sword like that.
Right. And it's still the same weapon. They just size it for their own
Yeah.
purposes and common sense. We
For
get
their
in
need.
trouble in the 21st century world because everything we use is mass manufactured rather than personally made. Similar example for the Dusak. Why are the German Dusaks so short? Well, in the German cities, they have regulations for how long your weapon can be. Because if you're carrying a giant fuck-off cavalry weapon in the middle of a crowded German city, people are tripping over you. It's a pain in the ass. No one wants a giant long weapon. And if there is going to be a brawl, God help you, you've got a weapon this long, you can't wield it. Perfect example, 1396. Okay. So there's a whole bunch of Burgundian and French people who are trying to take over Sigismund's attacks down towards the Ottoman Empire, Battle of Nicopolis. Halfway through the battle, the Burgundians who are in front, because they won't allow themselves to listen to Sigismund and go, hey, the warfare is really different. If you want to fight their elites, you've got to be patient and wait for the battle to evolve. They don't do it. So they get themselves in melee with a bunch of secondary units. They all drop their swords and start fighting with daggers. Now, why would a bunch of French knights drop their swords and fight with daggers? Well, because they're so close, there's no room to swing your sword anymore. So they go to dagger fighting, and as the chronicles say, they just annihilate the unit, because the Turkic guys they're fighting, they're secondary fighters. They have an issue weapon and some training, but they've never seen armored dagger fighting before. Not with the kind of fighting and the kind of heavy armor that the Burgundians are wearing. Of course, the corollary to this is, afterwards, having done that in heavy armor, when the Ottoman main forces show up, the Burgundians are exhausted. They've burned themselves out fighting in heavy armor, and the battle immediately goes tits up for the Europeans. And the Ottomans absolutely crush them. But you get this, why do I want a shorter weapon sometimes? Well, maybe I'm on board a ship. A cavalry saber is a bad idea if I'm on board a ship. My sword's useless if I can't swing it.
And then you have the cutlass and all its neighbors and family.
Right, and the coltellaccio in 16th century Italy is not a short weapon, but the cutlass as we know it in England is a short weapon because it's a saber that's being used on ship. And that's the context from which we know it.
Then comes the question of what exactly happened in the 18th century, end of the 17th, beginning of the 18th century, when straight swords started disappearing, or they slimmed down to the small sword and became weapons of the gentleman, and Western Europe suddenly, abandoning straight swords for military use, started using sabers. When did that switch happen? Can we blame the Polish? Because I think that maybe they're the earliest who started let's say, applying saber in more in more regular use and with organized armies in the 17th
So
century?
we can blame the Poles, we can blame the Hungarians, and we can blame the Ottomans. We blame the Poles for exactly the reasons you know. We blame the Hungarians because many of them are on the losing side of yet another rebellion and they have to run like hell. Many of them wind up in exile. Many of those people who are in exile flee to Prussia, where the Prussians are already familiar with the saber. They're already familiar with hussars. They're happy to put these guys to work. No giant change. Many of the others flee to the port, to Istanbul. They're available to be recruited. And when the French king wants extra manpower, the French wind up getting introduced to hussars. And as soon as they do that, these guys are so alien and so exotic that it literally rewrites French fashion overnight. The doublets and hose disappears in the 18th century, or the culotte. All of that fashion immediately starts going away in favor of trousers and longer coats upon their exposure to the kind of clothing that anyone in East Central Europe has looked at for literal centuries and doesn't find remarkable at all. Some measure of a kaftan or dolman or jupon, or pick your word, a slightly longer coat with trousers is native to the region. Well, it's not native to Western Europe, but it becomes so. In the process, you have a diminishing role for the sword on the battlefield because the bayonet is now moving from the plug bayonet to the socket bayonet. If I have a plug bayonet, my unit of fire, and that's how the 18th century people thought about it, the big military planners are much less concerned with individual prowess. And I know I'm breaking the heart of every HEMA Marshall crowd person who's listening to this. They were much less concerned about that than they were concerned about organized drill. Because everyone looks at 18th century military infantry use and goes, that's insane and stupid. Why did they do it? And that's precisely why it worked, because it was terrifying. And are you going to stand in front of 140 people who have turned themselves into a giant human shotgun and take those kinds of casualties? If you can't, you break, you've lost the battle. So plug bayonet's not useful for that, because the minute you put that bayonet in, you can't shoot anymore. And every single hand weapon is as good as every other hand weapon, accounting for its peculiar characteristics. But with the socket bayonet, now you can repel horsemen. Now you can fight other infantry people who are armed with hand weapons. Oh, and you can still shoot. You can still shoot. And your shooting will be less accurate, but it doesn't matter because you're shooting for area effect. Outside of specialist troops, no one cares if you can hit this. We save that for the people who are using rifles, which is literally the word for rifled muskets. Those people can knock a fly off a gnat's ass, but it takes them 6 times longer to reload. They can't dominate the battlefield. The musket is good enough. Well, the straight sword becomes what officers use. It also becomes something that civilians still carry for when they need to. But otherwise, its battlefield utility vanishes at precisely the time that most of the Western Europe is starting to realize, oh, hey, light cavalry is really useful, and they use sabers. Now, some of their sabers may wind up being straight because the French really adore thrust fencing. And as we know, there's certainly no objection to thrust fencing in the saddle from East Central Europe. Think about the really long pokey boys that the Hungarians and the Poles use. And I don't know what the Bulgarian term for the same weapon is. So for the Poles, the konsurs, for the Hungarians, it fell out of my head. Shame on my head. It literally translates to even pointier dagger.
I'm not sure if we actually have a specific Bulgarian term that has survived. I think that if you mean those which are usually saber hilted, but with a really, really long blade.
Yeah, you have a 2 meter long, really, really pokey blade, cheap metal, it's disposable. You poke them and drop it and move on.
Strange enough, I think, at least in some sources, they were called pawash as well, because they're with a saber hilt and straight, even though we were still under Ottoman rule when they were in heavy use. So if there were sources and terms, they probably got lost in time.
Okay, that makes sense. Yeah, and palash becomes the general term for a saber-hilted sword. And I grab, and some people argue that it's a little bit anachronistic, which may be fair. I tend to use the parry-riposte or the Byzantine term for the sword-hilted saber, but we see lots of those too.
Yeah.
And we see lots of those in the 14th century, because what if I want this long-handled furniture? Well, if you look at the old sabers, most of the old sabers had long-handled furniture, often quite light. Well, okay, maybe I have a straight one because that's what my blade happens to mount. Great. But I still want to curve. Great. A smith can do that. If I try to order this from a mass manufacturer to fit this hilt, I've got nothing to do. But my village or my castle smith can make that happen for me anytime I want. So we get lots of personal preference flying back and forth.
Yeah, and a lot of re-hilted blades and a lot of weird hilts. I think that Oakshott had one of the most extreme examples of a Viking sword, essentially Viking sword from the 10th century, which was re-hilted numerous times until someone re-hilted it into the 16th century in a Scottish basket hilt.
And why not? If the blade was still good and hadn't
The blade
been
was
torn
still
out.
good.
Yeah.
Probably shaved a lot of that of it, but from constant upkeep. But yeah, it was definitely still working. So
back when
doing that
David
for a long
Edge
time.
was still running the Wallace collection, my wife and I got a tour. My fiance at the time got a tour of it, and he said,
I've
"I'd
been
like
there,
to." Okay, so he said, "I'd like to introduce you to the biggest collection of sword blades and sword hilts that have nothing to do with each other in England." Because as he warned, people come to the museum thinking, oh, these are the period examples of these weapons. But he told me that almost every weapon in that museum had been re-hilted multiple times. Why would you show up with your granddad's sword furniture? It's embarrassing.
Yeah, and it also killed off some originals that we might have today, but we don't have them because someone reworked them into something else.
Right, because shockingly, people wanted things that worked for them. The other thing that goes into this is 18th century sabers are not what most people think sabers are. The 19th century mass manufacture of sabers results in lots of sabers, many of which, from the perspective of saber history, are total dog shit. They're trooper sabers and they are overbuilt. They are badly overbuilt. Their primary purpose is don't let the idiot farm boy break the saber abusing it again.
Mm-hmm.
And you can hear a back and forth in many of the weapon manufacturers' histories going, well, this is a good saber, but our troops keep breaking it, make it heavier, but then it's not a good saber. So a lot of people look at the modern sabers and they look at them and go, these things are dog shit. Well, yeah, they are. They're overbuilt, designed to avoid surviving trooper abuse. But you look at the NCO sabers, you look at the officer sabers, those are toward weights that would be considered bog standard for an 18th century saber. I've got one up here, for example. Hold on. Actually, this will be fun. I can reach for it. All right. So here's a saber.
Yep.
Okay.
Nice curve.
Nice curve, 1790s. Okay. Here it is. How much do you think this weighs?
Looking at the weight and the width of the blade, I don't know, 950 grams.
494.
You're kidding me.
494.
That can technically pass in modern fencing. That's
yes,
the limit
for
modern saber is 500 grams.
Look at the distal taper.
And it's thick.
See how it almost disappears down at the foible?
Yeah.
See how thick it is here? Wow. Look at how deep and wide this fuller is.
Yeah.
This wouldn't last 10 minutes in the hands of some ignorant plowboy cutting cabbage with it. He would break it on a tree stump.
Yeah, absolutely.
And yet, this is not a toy saber.
No.
There's nothing about this that says toy saber for prancing around a fencing school. And by weight, I could bring this to an Olympic competition.
Yeah.
It would be heavy, but within the scope of the rules. So it is really important to remember that a lot of the turn of the 19th century and 19th century sabers are not what most people think they are in HEMA because they simply don't have access to the good stuff.
Okay. Why do you think that? Is it missing sources, or is it the ease of British military saber and the like that people in HEMA have mostly focused on those types of sources?
So a lot of it is lack of sources. So in the 1990s, when I started doing this, I got involved in Saber. And what were the Saber things that were available? Okay, I was part of a living lineage. At the time, I didn't realize that the living lineage I was part of is actually not all that unusual for Austro-Hungarian fencing or for Hungarian fencing. It depends on how we split it out. For those of you who are from the region, I distinguish between Kaiserlich und Königlich Militärfechten from Honvéd fencing. So that's an internal army type division in Hungarian history. So the three people who are listening to you who know Hungarian history will now stop screaming at the screen. Okay. So these tend to have a certain way of using the blade that is very, very standard. My lineage just happened to not use the big hanging guards and to step funny. But I didn't know at the time that it was actually not as remarkable as I thought it was. I thought it was a weird ass lineage. I've spent a lot of time trying to understand where it came from. But otherwise, there was just no material available. And what was available in English tended to be backsword era stuff and widely available on the internet. You had people like Silver and you had Hutton's Cold Steel. Now, I have been on record, there's no distinguishing for anybody. As a fencing manual, I don't like Cold Steel. For what Hutton was trying to do at the time, which he says in the book, trying to introduce more variety when most of his clients in that era were stage actors and the regulation sword exercise isn't going to freaking cut it for Hamlet. It's exactly what it needs to be. It's lots of variations. The Swordsman and other manuals are very simple. They're very stripped down and they were available in English online. And because for accidents of the Cold War, etc., in the 1990s, English wound up becoming the language of international discourse. It's there. It's there and it's simple to use in an era when most HEMA people were not specialists. We hadn't developed the kind of really from the sources living lineage HEMA to where you had schools that really focused on one weapon. Most historical fencers and HEMA people were generalists. So a quick and easy manual that got you up and running quickly, extremely attractive. Well, now we have available for those who want to do the deep dive, 70 to 80 manuals, many of which are available, if not in full translation. We now know an awful lot more of the history of this weapon. And I'm not even including the Renaissance material that most of HEMA calls medieval because they don't know the history, and that's okay. They're not specialists. They're not specialists. I'm not going to take them to task for that. Well, shit, now I have to box that. 133, your least favorite sword and buckler manual we have, is the only HEMA manual we can solidly date to be actually medieval. Everything else is either end of the Middle Ages or beginning of the Renaissance, depending on how you categorize it. Quattrocento Italy is Renaissance because the Renaissance is a cultural phenomenon, not a date on a calendar.
That's true. I would argue that also MS 3227A would be closer to medieval than Renaissance.
I would agree.
Based on the language used, but it's on the edge as well. Yeah.
Yeah, and as a HEMA dinosaur, I have spent a lot of time in Dubin's house book, much more than with Ringek, Danzig, and the others that are the more modern or contemporary KDF. I would agree with you on that. But most HEMA people don't understand the degree to which we're really studying Renaissance and early modern swordplay, not medieval swordplay. The Middle Ages is mostly over by the time these documents become available to us, simply on economics. Francis of Assisi once sold a little tiny hymnal like this thick so that a widow living across the valley could afford to eat for the winter. When all of your words are written on sheepskin, writing is expensive, and you only do it when there's a reason to do it.
I've been trying to explain to people a lot that books, even in the early Renaissance, books were a luxury, and they were extremely expensive. Creating a fencing treatise, especially one with illustrations, but even one without, was just like a big project, like building a hotel today or building a big house or something like that. It wasn't something that you need a lot of people to work on it. It wasn't a small thing. I don't think
Wasn't
most
a
people
small thing at all.
realize it.
And
Yeah.
that plays into some of the sources that become available. Why do we not have, in spite of the fame of the Shashka, why do we not have a native Russian saber manual? Well, Catherine the Great is where we begin to see an intelligentsia class in Muscovy. That's very late in the game. And by the turn of the 20th century, European Russian illiteracy had gone all the way down to 80%. And many of those would be considered functionally illiterate by the standards of the day. The intelligentsia were reading in French. There was very little in the way of native Russian literature to go around because there were very little in the way of native Russian readers. We're not going to find written manuals from that era for the average Russian, because the average Russian of that era, intelligent, charismatic, wise, as he or she may have been, was still not literate at all. And that's in European Russia, where the numbers are way higher than the other side around. So a lot of this becomes tail chasing if we only privilege the written source first. But for fencing methodology, we have to. And that's the trap we easily fall into if we're not careful.
But nowadays we have a lot more sources. You yourself have a very big series of 11 books. I think at some point maybe you've done that and I've missed it, but you maybe need to write a guide on which to pick up and what to expect of them, because the descriptions on Amazon don't tell me enough, unless I just decide to read all 11, which at some point I'll probably do. So the sources you've some translated, edited, and so on. Can you tell me a little bit more about them as a group and
Absolutely.
the kind of saber fencing they show?
Okay, so don't hurt your wallet, although my wife would love it. If you want a copy of everything, it's actually up to 16 or 17 now. So these are, so I'm a scholar from the background. I'm a recovering academic. I'm still a history professor as a day job.
Oh, God.
These are what we call source editions. So the source edition process is we want to have a discussion on a topic, but first we have to find out what the hell the topic is, right? Part of your question to me, hey, sabers have been around a long time. Most of HEMA doesn't know that. Most of HEMA doesn't know that the thing I spouted off about with Dusak and Longismesser is actually the most historical, most defensible opinion, controversial as that will be among many people listening to this. They don't have the background for it. Cool. So how do you get people the background? Well, we publish and translate source editions and get them in a format everyone can get access to. And that's what I've been doing. Now, I was sort of maltrained linguistically. I do pretty good Spanglish. That's Spanglish for those of you who didn't catch the joke there. And my French is, and my little tiny bit of Italian is completely useless for the East European context in which I found myself. In literally living, because I lived in Hungary for several years. So
and Hungarian is an alien language even in the region, so you're okay in that regard.
Yeah, so many of Hungary's neighbors, look at the Magyars and go, oh, it's a bunch of Mongols. I don't speak that. The nice part about that is that if you are in Hungary and you do speak Hungarian, even the street gutter trash Hungarian I speak, people are really amazed that you take the effort to learn it. In fact, I confused people very often by ordering something in street everyday Hungarian, because that's how I learned. I didn't have a formal class in Hungarian and never have. And then something more complicated got said, and I had to, beg pardon because my vocabulary was really small. And they looked at me stunned, like, wait, you're not Hungarian? It's kind of like if you speak French and you say "ouais" rather than "oui," and everybody knows you're a provincial from Quebec, but then it turns out you don't speak any other French. So it confuses the hell out of people.
Yeah.
So these source editions are using translators who know the original language very well. but their English may be dicey in terms of formal writing. And I have long experience of that, editing academic papers and academic manuscripts for scholars who want to publish in English, but for example, Georgian. There's almost no sentence order in Georgian. Or ask a Slavic speaker when you use the English word the, or when you use the English word a, or when you can leave it off. It's very confusing because the underlying linguistics don't work the same way. Sometimes if I want you to translate something into Bulgarian, you'll have to give a whole paragraph to encompass that idea. And sometimes you'll say it in 2 words, even though I've spoken a paragraph. Sometimes these languages are much more condensed than English. Sometimes they're much more elaborated. So what I do is the translation from the halfway point into full colloquial English. And then I edit for context and put editor's comments in the middle. And we're just cranking through as many of these as I can afford to edit. I don't have a big budget. It takes me about 2 to 2.5 years to break even on any title. A few I broke even on fairly early. Some I still haven't broken even on, just depending on who has the interest to purchase them. And yes, in fact, this year I have begun to lay the groundwork for Uncle Russ's big book of HEMA Saber to explain how these all relate on a geometric and process basis, so people who are interested in Saber can look at it and go, oh, where do I want to start based on what I think is cool? And for the people who are more rigorous in studying it, they can go, okay, why does this relate to that, relate to that? If I say that weight in Britain has a lot in common with Prussian saber fencing, well, we're used to thinking in the nationalistic lens. That's going to confuse a lot of people. But if you look at Waite's engaging guard versus the Flachelage of the Berlin school, you suddenly start to realize why Waite doesn't bother having a guard of tierce. He doesn't need to. Well, turns out Waite went to the continent on a regular basis and was part of fencing competitions and stuff there, and he took his students out there with him. He already absorbed a lot of stuff. Well, martial artists bump into each other, steal ideas from each other, or if they don't steal them, see an idea and get inspired to create their own ideas. That's why, for example, both of our Urgesta in longsword publicly admit that they're syncretic works. Lichtenauer studies with lots of people. Fiore de Liberi studies with lots of people. And now I'm going to give you a system with unified mechanics that covers all the ideas and threats I've bumped into. That's how martial arts works. So the big book of Saber is going to try to make that available for people. It is a lot of freaking work because I'm going to have to summarize the best I can 70 or 80 manuals in a form that can be an easy reference and digestible. So there's probably going to be realistically a couple of years down the road before that actually comes out. Plus, I really want some of the lesser known manuals to get out there first. We have a lot of material for the Saber that people just don't know is hanging around. Some of it is immensely cool and counterintuitive. Swedish Saber. Who knew the Swedes did so much non-linear footwork and how well it applies? Or De Frias, which is in process right now. Mexican Saber. Why does Mexican Saber have so much in common with Hungarian Saber? I don't know, but the Mexicans sure like their polka. Now they call it ranchero, but the difference between ranchero and polka is what language are you singing in?
Okay, if we look at this collection of sources that you're familiar with, can you try and describe, let's say, a fundamental idea of, not all of them, of course. I'm sure there are some differences which at least may appear fundamental, but on those systems overall, what is fundamental definition and fundamental core idea structure that supports saber fencing?
Okay, so saber fencing as different from straight sword fencing in the 18th, 19th century.
Yes, I would say so.
Becomes something very different. Saber fencing becomes the training for cut fencing. Straight sword fencing becomes the training for thrust fencing. Now, if you are French, Your cut fencing sits on top of a layer of thrust fencing. Foil or small sword becomes the training vehicle for your cut fencing. The British take that idea, they don't do it as rigorously as the French do, and I'm not slagging the British. The British had a giant heyday of fencing, 16th to 18th century, 18th to 19th century, the wheels fall off and the Brits are doing other things, like inventing modern sport, which is modern sport as we know it is a British invention. So it's one area in which we happen to live where the Brits are really, really behind in the 18th, 19th century. It's not slagging British culture in general. All of our fencing that you know of in sporty HEMA rolls back to British culture in terms of sports development. So the French build everything on the thrust, and they have complicated gestures for how to get from cut to thrust. So they like their sabers more straight and curved.
Yeah.
The Spanish are still playing with footwork and variations of footwork that you can use with a cutting horseback blade. Their blades are often curved. The Italians want to play from advanced lunge distance because that's what all of their fencing history says. So their saber fencing starts to really move from, I can also do cut fencing from advanced lunge range. And that's the goal that Italian fencing has always been pushing. And they managed to do it with the Rhode fencing. And because they're used to living at advanced lunge range and everyone else is used to living at just lunge range, for the space of 40 or 50 years, they have an incredible advantage over everybody, and they clean people's clocks for a long time.
I was going to say that was, I think, in the previous century, that was a very strong meta in modern fencing as well, modern saber fencing.
Absolutely, yes. And to the extent that they have to ban the flesh, because how far can I extend reach becomes the name of the game. Now, by that point, as the world wars are rolling through, it's the English and the French setting the rules for the tools. So modern Olympic saber is straight, not curved, because it's not important to those guys culturally. Germans do cut fencing with either a palache or a saber, and what they want to do is cut angles. They are the bar none masters of cut a sharp angle that your opponent doesn't realize has been cut yet, and in the very next tempo you crush them. And that goes from Kunstfechten all the way into modern saber and cut fencing work.
I was going to say that sounds like KDF actually got extrapolated into German saber.
Sure. German saber. The Marxbrüder exist in the Jena school of fencing in the 18th century. That lineage you can walk it all the way back to the Renaissance. So these guys are around and have been around for a very long time. They're just not using great granddad's old embarrassing swords. And when they have, for example, their very steep defensive positions that they will often use hinging in the hip. Well, they took that hip hinging, saw the Italians doing it and go, wait a minute, I can make this work for so many other things. And they use it to cut angles in their cut fencing, which becomes really interesting. For the Hungarians, it's all about the false edge and always has been. Also about cutting with the fingers. The Hungarians can do powerful cuts using finger cuts, whereas most of Europe looks at finger cuts as intuitively weak. We see some of that with the Poles as well. For example, Ivanovsky's method, I've got it back there, it's the blue one on the bookshelf back there. He is teaching the same method of using the hand and the finger as an oscillation point to generate power with the saber that Le Marchand learns from a Hungarian sergeant in the 18th century before he brings his method back to England. In some ways, it's kind of a pity that Le Marchand's drill didn't really survive in England. It got overwhelmed with other systems, and Le Marchand's system of cutting didn't catch on with the Brits. The Brits really like their firm-handed fist grip as opposed to a more supple fist grip.
Might that be tied to the fact that, from what I remember, a lot of Polish sabers at one time had also a thumb ring as an addition on the hilt?
So maybe. The thumb ring allows you to use this method of cutting with an extra point of stabilization, and you don't have to lock it down hard. That little extra stabilization can really help. Yep.
I've handled one, and it's an interesting addition.
Yeah, and you notice it tends to be on the big, heavy military sabers.
Yeah.
So for the Carabella, you don't need it. The support is already, the Carabella grip gives you really, really good support. And the blades tend to be lighter. There's a couple guys out there in Lithuania who I know who are going to be screaming in the screen saying, no, we have some very heavy Carabella. And it's true, there are. But in general, they're not the thump you on horseback saber blades that the sabers that have the thumb rings are. So yeah, you get that little extra stabilization. So for the Poles, they don't want it too stabilized, because when they're doing what the Hungarians would call a switch moulinet, which I just did in the air, or cross from this line to this line, too stable means that becomes inhibited. For the Hungarians, that's too loose and it prevents you from using the false edges effectively. So we tend to clamp down on it just a bit more. We tend to do more down here than up here, although both exist. It's a little bit more stable, which makes the false edge more useful, but less apt for, here comes the Cuisinart, or what's the nickname for Krupp's latest blender on sale in East Central Europe? The blender style of moulinet, which stylistically and intellectually is very simple, but will still get your ass kicked if you don't know how to handle it. It's very effective if you don't know how to take down somebody who can moulinet 3 times in the space of when somebody else is throwing one blow. It's a tempo advantage if you know how to weaponize it.
The one thing that I've noticed, I've recently started doing some saber. By doing some saber, I mean I have a saber and I spar people with it. There was a local saber club till recently. The guy moved into another town. I may visit him at some point again, and we have neighbors doing saber as well. But specifically in my city, there is no saber. It's never been my focus. I recently got a saber because I want to test it at tournaments, and I've noticed a couple of things. First of all, I've had a jump like this before in terms of hand protection, which I think makes one of the bigger differences from arming sword to side sword. As you know, side sword, at least in terms of basic hand protection, gets us closer to saber in some ways.
Absolutely. What many people need to realize with side sword, though, let me interrupt you just a moment, is if you go look at many of the originals, our replicas are still, for the most part, far too heavy. Side swords are not slow, heavy weapons. This is a HEMA artifact. Go look in the armories, get somebody to sweet talk somebody into walking you back, and you see all that hand protection on a weapon that is paper thin.
Absolutely.
They are very light and very handy.
It's also the reality. If you want to make a training weapon that's gonna last a couple of years and people are not gonna complain that you're making shitty and not very durable weapons, you're gonna overbuild it a little bit. Although again, I've been used to arming swords, so going to side sword was actually things getting lighter for me. But one of the big things that I've noticed is immediately I don't have to protect as you can imagine, with arming sword, the hand is open, so I have to be constantly aware where I put it and be constantly ready to back it up. The moment I started using a side sword, that worry, it didn't disappear, but when you're used to protecting yourself with just a cross guard, the moment you have a knuckle bow and some rings, it's almost like you're in heaven and things get easy.
Things get much easier. When I teach the classical Italo-Hungarian lightsaber to the children on Saturday night, I have to make adjustments for the fact that, the lightsabers have no handguards whatsoever. So it's a tremendous difference.
Which wasn't uncommon when teaching, because we can see even rapier sources from the 17th century, and I think there are a couple of surviving ones. It seems that they used training rapiers with just a simple crossguard. So that wasn't uncommon as part of teaching fencing.
And if you really know what you're doing, a crossguard is enough hand protection. Especially if you're looking at what's my hand position. Well, if you can see the crossguard, you know exactly what the hand position is. Now, some people will be irritated by that, but full context, my first exposure was playing with replicas of 9th, 10th century sabers, where the crossguard is this wide and has a little ball over here and a little ball over here.
Yeah, we have a couple of those,
So I look at even a crossguard, let alone a big shell, and I'm thinking, it's free real estate. I feel about a big crossguard the way you feel about the shell.
But
it makes
then
a huge difference. You can leave.
I came to the saber. I got the saber, and I got a Sigi saber naturally because I'm a Sigi shield. and it's with the big, nice shell cup, whatever you want to call it. In I don't remember what the Bulgarian term for that is. I have to ask my guys.
Hungarians use koshar or basket. I'll be interested to see if they use something like basket or if they go with shell or bowl.
I gotta check. But the change wasn't as big as before, and I'm also kind of missing the cross. Maybe because I'm very used to engaging when there is a bind, engaging the blade with the cross. A lot of people tell me, "Oh, there are no binds in Saber. You don't need that anyway." I found out there are plenty of binds in Saber. I just cannot lock it in because I don't have the cross and I just have the bow.
So you fix that. I'm going to pretend that this is the blade and the bowl. Okay.
Yeah.
Anyone who says there's no binding in Saber has paid attention to too many modern epee videos.
Yep.
Saber is a weapon that wants the bind. And this spot right here on your strong is a three-dimensional spot where if you can get the block here and let it gather into your bowl, it's not as pronounced as the cross. You have less margin for error, but you can bind there and keep somebody there. Whereas if you block here, they'll escape from your blade very easily. It takes some practice because it's less apt for the purpose than a giant Kian, which is why I'm the one guy who said, hey, I really like a big Kian. If I have a big Kian and I'm using my weapon the way I want to use the weapon, the Kian's enough because I can lock things out.
The other thing that I noticed as a bigger difference on the very rough part of things, and I'll show you a short clip in a bit so you can see it for yourself. But the one thing that if we're talking about very rough, big actions and very simple things like a parry-riposte, things weren't that different. If I have to go and fight somebody in a very simple encounter where there is not much tactics involved and the clash is gonna be imminent, I think that the arming sword, for example, which is my fundamental weapon, and the saber are incredibly similar. When it comes to simple actions, simple attacks, things are going to be very, very similar, and nothing is going to change that much. And I'm sure a person from the 13th century grabbing a saber from the 17th or 18th will be absolutely fine, and vice versa.
He'll be disgusted that there's so much weight at the hand. The 13th century man won't want the big, heavy handguard, but otherwise, no. The geometry is fundamentally the same. The basic form of the saber that you know from your Bulgarian finds, here's my slightly curved or canted handle, here's my mild curve. It's the same weapon. They're familiar with it. Of course, it's not going to be a giant change. They have run centuries of history with both of these weapons side by side. So you have a method that has to be good for both weapons. Well, if I have a slightly heavier longsword, I play differently than if I have a slightly lighter longsword, right? If I'm playing with a slightly larger buckler, I play differently than with a slightly heavier buckler or a smaller buckler, right? If I happen to have a straight weapon, I play slightly differently than if I have a curved weapon. For my lineage, if I want to make this opposition parry and I have a straight blade, I put the tip a little forward and I do a little more rotation, just like I showed before. With the curved blade, I lack the reach, but I get more influence from this. It makes perfect sense that many of those things are absolutely in common, and it won't make a big difference if you already know how to fence.
Now, the moment where the difference really started to show up, and I'm not even sure that one can see it from the side, is the moment when I need to make sharp changes in direction, the moments when I'm trying to feint, the moments when I'm trying to create an idea or bait the other person, because then the saber that at the time when I got it, I literally had like a couple of hours with it, so I wasn't very familiar with it at all. It was, I could force it to do it because I have the strength to do it and it's a light weapon, but I was forcing it to do it. It had a different, even the balance, the static balance wasn't that different, but the dynamic balance and the way that the weapon moves and changes direction is, all other things considered, it's very different. And that's
absolutely.
One of the
and it's the same rotation I'm talking about. If I swing a straight thing, And if you look at the people who are doing mostly straight things, you will tend to find a moulinet or a molinello that tends to be a circle. When I have a curve, my weapon no longer wants to do a circle because this mass out here creates a drag and it starts to want to do a helix for its moulinet. It rotates differently in the hand. And that is the big difference between the two. So when I begin to rotate the weapon, does it want to continue in a straight line or does it want to start doing this and to precess out to the side, thus giving me an action like this? The short answer I've been giving people for years and years is that the longsword, for example, because that's the HEMA mainstay, the longsword is more powerful on the attack and it's faster to the bind. The saber is faster in the bind because every rotation is more meaningful.
Yeah, and I found by accident that sometimes you can change direction and you can make a cut that with an arming sword or a side sword, I can make a touch with it, but I know it's not going to be a quality cut. While because of the shape of the blade and the curve, and I didn't use even a very curved saber. I used the straighter one. Even a small curve, actually, when you do a quick change of direction, it gives you enough load-up time that you know that the cut would actually be a valid one and a martial one, so to speak.
Yeah, it's a big problem for the saber guys that a lot of the judges for saber aren't used to them. So a lot of times we'll do, so Kunsteffekten, where do you see Schnitt for the most part? Pressing the hands.
Pressing the hands.
Because the hands are delicate, right? But if I do this kind of cut with a false edge, I can pull somebody off balance with a training blade. I have enough body weight and mass that if I were doing this, I would pull a hand off. But with a straight sword, I don't have this as much. Sometimes, coup de jarnac, if I catch the tendon on the back of the knee, great. But otherwise, this is incidental contact. So there have been circumstances, the last tournament I went to, which is not as many as I should because my lungs are fried. My endurance is just crap and going to be no matter what. But I was in a bout and I took the false edge right across through somebody's armpit. And I didn't dig it in because I'm not a jackass. No one needs those pressure points dug in with a training saber, right?
Yeah.
It got called incidental and I got told I had to hit harder. So the very next guy was a guy who had cracked my ribs in competition 6 or 7 years earlier. Good guy. I zigged when he zagged. It was an accident that happened. Cracked my ribs through a thick, heavy longsword jacket. It was just body weight versus body weight. Yeah. So I hit him with a false edge on the ribs. And he was like, oh, Rush, you got your revenge. I was like, it's not my fault. The judge told me to hit harder. But those blows land differently when you've got this to create leverage versus when you have this that's not creating that leverage.
I'll throw in a note that I think this is also a general issue in HEMA right now, that a lot of people, some who are organizing tournaments and some who are judges, don't realize the actual potential of swords to do damage. And I remember Anton Kuhutovic recently, a couple of months ago, told me a story about that. He was judging a tournament, and as you know, in Slovakia, the hit quality they require is not huge. But he was still judging a match, and one of the fencers hit the other on the arm, on the hand specifically, and he was like, okay, in this specific moment, I think this is low quality. And he was just about to call it low quality, even by the Slovak standards. And then the guy who was hit was like, fuck! And it turned out the thumb was broken. So sometimes blows that look very light are actually incredibly capable of doing damage. The other issue is how our judges are prepared, and this is something that we are working on.
Yeah, but I've been dying on this hill for 30 years. Even in the local scene back when we were all using wasters, I had a guy who was a boat builder make me a waster with good quality wood, and it was thick at the base and very, very thin up here. People couldn't break them. And they swung at each other, and immediately they started cutting rather than bashing because the tool wasn't overbuilt and it didn't make them swing too hard. I have been losing this fight for 30 years. If someone else wants to take that fight and succeed where I have failed, I am with it. And I have a real life example. I have a friend in Pennsylvania. How many times have you seen a longsworder before a tournament do this? That little rest the blade on the shoulder before they
Yeah.
go. He did that before a cut on a tatami mat. Just this play, no more than that. Just
And it
enough to
bit
let.
into it, right?
No, it bisected it completely.
Oh,
He
yeah.
was out for a long time as that muscle healed. And it was just that reflexive this that people do because it's blunt and you want to save energy and you're tired competing, especially if you did lots of free bouting and drinking the day before, as happens in many tournaments. And that was enough to completely bisect the trapezius.
Yeah.
These things do not require heavy hits to do insane damage. And I think the more that becomes relevant, the more people will become comfortable with giving each other permission to play with lighter, safer tools. And when you have the distal taper obvious, people will stop smashing. They smash now because where's the weight? The tool says I must smash to be successful. Put an original in somebody's hands where they can feel the difference in the weight in there, and they immediately stop smashing because they don't need to. It's counterproductive. It buys them nothing. Turn them loose on a rose bush or something that needs to be trimmed, and in 10 seconds flat, all of a sudden they can make tatami level quality cuts because the tools taught them how to do it.
Okay, you want to check the video I've prepared for
Absolutely.
you? I think that
Let's
might
show
be
them
interesting.
something interesting rather than old ass me talking.
I'm not sure how interesting it is because it's essentially I think this one is this is gonna be better. This is essentially it's a fight in the booth at the local tournament in Serbia, Washfechten 2025. It was in the heat in the summer, so and we were the previous day they had longsword. This was the next day, just saber. I'm fencing in this video. This is just the fencing exchanges. I've deleted everything, so it's not that boring. This on the right is Stefan Milenkovic. He's the local saber instructor. I am honestly not sure what sources he works on. Maybe you can guess that. We've also, so you can have know the history, he also did side sword before, and we fenced many times in side sword, both competed. So we know each other very well as fencers in another weapon. And he also won the gold at that tournament. This is our first fight in the pools.
And you're both starting an extended fourth, which is music
this
in my heart.
This is a greeting. This is a greeting.
Ah, okay.
This is a greeting because we know each other. We go to the center, greet each other, and then we start somewhere. Yeah.
Yep, he's got you moving with the transitions from second.
Keep in mind, this is a blow after blow tournament.
Okay.
So a lot of hits to the head remove the after blow.
Okay.
I love it.
And you're going for that hit to get, yeah.
Yeah, that was, I will repeat that exchange. This was one of the parries that I just didn't I'm used to this being capable of taking a blow, but here I miscalculated and he passed through the neck. The judges didn't see it, so I called it.
Right.
I really wanted to trust the Saber guy.
You should. And it's really fun to stab Saber guys in the hands behind their big bowl.
That I haven't tried yet.
Many of them think their hands are safe, but that hand and that wrist can be picked just as easily with a bowl as with anything else.
So this is the moment where tactically I turn things around because I realized that that I'm lagging behind, despite the fact that I'm just as fast as he is. When we have an initial clash, I lag behind, so I just changed the tactic and started working on other approaches.
So you start playing the counter riposte game.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's a good call. I often have to do that because I have so many injuries. I can tell when I get in stance in a longer tournament whether I can be aggressive or whether I have to not be aggressive based on how my body's feeling that day. That was nice. That was really nice. Both of you kept playing the tempo.
Yeah, that one I managed to get into warm up to the weapon a little bit more.
Mm-hmm.
I think this is probably another double.
Yep.
Yeah, or no, I think he got me clean, and I think this is the last one, which was also yeah, that was the
Mm-hmm.
last one. And it's also where I managed to
Yep.
parry the after blow. So yeah, I'll turn it off.
Yeah. So different eras of Saber would score that differently, and that's okay.
Yeah, absolutely.
The right of way people would say stop remising after you've been parried. The other folks would say cover up better after you've gone into your next hit. Nice fencing.
What do you think? Thank you. What do you think when you watch someone who's obviously done Saber on the right and someone who's obviously forcing the Saber on the left? Is there, I don't know, does it show when you watch it
Yes,
like this?
it does. Because many of your parries are not in the hand position that an experienced Saber guy would be. Let me give you an example.
Yeah.
You almost went up into a real ox type position for that
Yeah.
parry at first, whereas the Saber person would have put their hand about here. So same idea, but the hand would have been lower to cover the line and get that strong here. Because with two hands on the weapon, I can make that higher position work because I have extra leverage. Here is where you would defend a blow like this because the weak of your Saber doesn't have the mass to stop that incoming blow.
Yeah.
So there are
Yeah.
a number of places where you wind up binding towards the middle of the Saber that an experienced Saber fencer wouldn't do. But we also have plenty of systems from earlier on where again, like I talked about with KDF, where those middle binds are being weaponized. It's something you see very often. If you were coming out of rapier traditions, what I would have probably have seen more of is a lot of turn the shoulders to cut the angle or make things unavailable here with little hand rotations, trying to hunt for advantage that way. You can see if you have enough experience, a really serious KDF person can probably tell the difference between a Dobringer Housebook kind of KDF and an RDL kind of KDF. I could certainly tell the difference between someone who does Dobringer versus someone who does Meyer.
Yeah, that's a difference you can definitely spot.
Yeah, and I'm no longer I'm familiar with the material. I'm one of the guys who was dragging this shit out of archives, but I'm by no means a KDF specialist. And if I can see that, I know a specialist can.
So, a lot of my personal experience in HEMA has been, well, it's all started with Lichtenauer and arming sword and longsword. But then I started doing other stuff because other stuff was available. I think a lot of people who do HEMA a little bit longer, maybe not since Methuselah's time like you do, but like the 15 or 16 years that I've been doing it, start dabbling other stuff. And what I found out, because for example, about 6 or 7 years ago, I also started doing rapier. And I found out that doing rapier is actually very helpful for my longsword and arming sword game because the focus on the thrust polished my thrusting skills and made me much more aware of where to place them, how to place them, and generally understand the tempo and the thread of thrusting better.
If I'm not mistaken, I'll make a prediction and that it also improved your cut fencing as well. Because it changes your understanding of distance. So my guess, I'm throwing this out here as a prediction. Tell me whether I'm full of shit or not. Are you ready? After you did rapier fencing, you were able to land feints more easily while cutting than you were before.
Yeah, but I'm not sure if that's just the rapier or just my general fencing skill, because I was doing everything else as well. But okay. Yeah. Definitely working with a weapon that forces a different distance, which very long rapiers do. And when you fence really good fencers who can make a thrust at you and with a lunge from like 6 meters away, you definitely have to up your cut game as well. But I also tell people that most of our students, of course, start with longsword or arming sword. I also
Mhm.
tell them if they have an interest, if they have the money to spend, and there are plenty of rapier tournaments in the region, they should also try rapier for the same reason. Now, my question is this: what do you think in that? In my example, I've done arming sword and longsword, sword and buckler, two weapons of various types. Then I've done rapier, and rapier added something to it. A side sword, I would say, side sword. I just feel like it's an arming sword with some extras, but rapier definitely added something to it. Then using different tools and so on. What do you think Saber would add to someone like me, someone who has experience with early cut and thrust weapons, or more thrust focused weapons? And then what would I get from Saber?
So trooper level Saber, where it's just here's the moulinet, here's your basic attacks and defenses, isn't going to give someone with your level of experience very much.
Mm-hmm.
You already know how to make those movements. So if you were a complete beginner who was interested in Saber, I would steer you towards one of those manuscripts
Yeah,
immediately. At
absolutely.
your level of fencing, what Saber is going to give you is actions in the bind that combine with footwork and coordinate the hands and feet. The ability to make meaningful threats and feints where every hand motion is synonymous with a foot motion and vice versa, or you can deny that in terms of wrong footing somebody in terms of tempo.
Mm-hmm.
So because every little turn of the Saber is different, it will polish your ability to work inside the bind because every little turn is now a threat. Whereas if I'm here, the difference between here and here, does it matter? Yes, it all matters. All geometry matters, but this is much less of a threat than if I'm here versus here. In
Mm-hmm.
Saber,
Yeah.
this and this, once you're past the kicking superficial ass level of fencing, once you're done with trooper fencing basics, this and this are not the same guard. Because the curve of the Saber will say different things become more threatening here and less threatening here. Different things are more threatening here and less threatening here. If I line up in a specific way with a straight sword, okay, here's my fourth, like I'm playing small sword. If I do this with a curved weapon, I can do some things very easily and not others. If I do this, I've now completely altered the engagement. And what having a curved weapon in hand will teach you is the long weapon in a short space. How do all those angle changes matter? So then you take it back to your straight weapon, a long weapon in a long space, and you'll be much more sensitive to those fine degrees. Give you an example. A beginning trooper fencer guy is thinking, okay, here's my edge, or my edged flat.
Yeah.
But if I take a strong on strong bind and I'm sensitive to those little changes, I can hit edge bevel. And if I can hit my edge to your bevel, I can blow right through your attack without using much force at all.
Yeah, you can definitely feel that if you have worked also with, let's say, blunt long swords, which more resemble Type 15 instead of the common flat ones today.
Absolutely, the diamond
It's
makes it
small
really
things.
apparent.
Yeah, it's small things, but you can actually feel it when you can bind not to just to the flat, but to one of the flats. And
Absolutely. And that's what Saber will give somebody who wants to cross train is embrace the curve. Don't do trooper level stuff. Do the more advanced stuff and see where the placement of the curve changes the entire engagement. Not just the point, not just the hand, but the entire arc of the weapon and what that sensitivity will then do for your sword and buckler or your long sword or your other game.
another thing that I think some people who are interested in Saber wonder is uh, how curvy should they go? For example, first of all, the blades are interchangeable, so at some point I can get a curvier one. But I decided for tournament purposes, to just go with something I'm more familiar with. Do you think it's also important to try and pick a Saber with a more pronounced curve?
No, Each
No.
different method prefers a certain kind of curve, okay?
Ah.
So if I want to do real Lamarchand 1796 saber, with the method the 1796 saber was intended to be used with, I want a very curved saber because it's meant for that. But for example, most Hungarian and most Bulgarian sabers are not very heavily curved.
Yeah.
Obviously, there are some back and forth. They have the curved handle, and the blade has a curve, and the point is in parallel with my hand. So I have the advantage of a curved blade for cutting and for maneuvering, but I also have instantly available thrusts. So I do not think you have to or even should run to the most curved thing on site unless the method you're going for or what you want to imitate directly runs for that big curve. If I want to play Shamshir and Separ, I don't want to do that with a straight bladed weapon. I can do it, but it's not going to be the same game.
Yeah, the thing I've played with Kaluch, good Kaluch reconstruction, and things change a lot because of the specific dynamic balance of the blade. It stops resembling Saber and looks more like one of those heavier messers or falchions than the sabers that most of us are familiar with.
And that's not an accident. Slab-hilted sabers, what's a longus messer? It's got that big slab hilt, and you look at the killage, they're not usually just rectangles. There's a lot of taper and mass distribution to cleverly play with where that balance is going to be in these weapons. And lots of slab-hilted swordish knife blades were exported by the tens of thousands from East Central Europe to the Ottomans. Everybody knew each other's tools.
Okay. There was one more topic that I wanted to talk to you about, but then I realized that if we started, we're going to be here for another 2 hours. So
okay, I've got time if you want to do a TLDR, or you can cut me off and we can call it a day.
I would rather let people enjoy the hour and a half that we gave them and tease them in the future that we might have that talk again. And I'll just mention that aside from fencing, you do a lot of stuff connected with mobility, movement, and general biomechanics, something that people love to talk about in HEMA, but very few actually do. And I think it's an important thing, especially when people get older. And like many people, I would like to fence when I'm well, by the time they get to bury me, I would prefer to be fencing as much as I can.
Yeah.
And I'm sure you do too. So I think this is a topic that we should cover sometime at some point and do this talk again and get really in depth to it. Maybe with bigger space with the camera so we can talk and show stuff to each other.
I'd be very happy to do that if you want to, and I can bring a victim so I can do some demonstrations for how things work.
Oh, that's
in fact, one of the next things I'm going to put up, I'm behind on filming because I've been really sick this last month and a half, but I've got something going up that's going to talk about structure and the role of the pelvis. It's there. I do a lot of it. I'm happy to talk about it to people for as long as they're happy to listen to it.
Yeah, I was going to say that people should really check out your channel. And at some point, I would love to have a discussion, maybe bring some different weapons in, because for example, I found some interesting things in regards to body mechanics when it comes to two weapons and sword and buckler specifically that I would love to check with you.
Oh, and I'm going to, at some point in my copious spare time, write my Nova Lexio on 133, and you will be very angry with me.
It's okay. I know you have like 70 Saber books before that, so I'm not sure you're gonna live that long. Thank you very much for this, Russ, and I hope we can talk again about more topics.
Absolutely. Thank you. Pleasure meeting you finally.
Same.